Hey guys, hope you're doing well. Today we're going a little deeper into ball python genetics, and we're going to do that by taking a look at the piebald gene. So get ready, let's dive in. The piebald gene is recessive. When we breed a visual piebald to a completely normal, we can expect all the babies to look normal while carrying one copy of the piebald gene. Let's make sure using the Punnett Square. So we represent a visual piebald with the letters PP as lowercase, and then we represent a normal with the letters NN as uppercase. You should know I like to represent recessive genes with lowercase and dominant genes with uppercase. Now let's see what we get with this pairing of piebald to normal. So again, we put the lowercase p's at the top because that's the father, and we'll put the n's on the left because that's the mother. When we work out the Punnett square, we see that all the offsprings carry a dominant N and a recessive P, making the baby look normal but carry the gene for piebald. This is otherwise known as het for pied or het for piebald. So in order to produce piebald babies, we need to step things up and only breed adult pythons with at least one piebald gene. The possible pairings are piebald to piebald, piebald to het piebald to piebald, and het piebald to het piebald. Now if we work through these Punnett squares, we get these results. So here are the results of that pairing. Now let's calculate the percentages. This is the first pairing. It's a piebald to piebald, and we have all piebald offsprings as expected, but let's just make sure by calculating the percentages. Each one of these quadrants represent 25% of the population, so we represent that by writing it here. 25% corresponds to each of the quadrants. Since they're all the same genes, we can just add them all up, equaling 100%. Now here's the second pairing. We have a piebald to a het pied, and this is the results of that Punnett square. As we can see, we have two quadrants with NP, so we have NP at 25%, NP as 25%. Then we have two quadrants with P and P, and we represent that with 25% here and 25% here. Now we just have to combine the like genes, so this would equal 50%, and this would equal 50%. That means half of the babies would look normal and carry the piebald gene, making them het for piebald, and then the other 50% of the babies would actually be visual piebald. Over here, it's the same scenario, but as you can see, the pivot is a little bit different. We have both het for piebald on the left and the piebalds on the right. Over here, het for piebalds are on the top and piebalds are on the bottom, but that doesn't matter because the percentages is what we're after. So by adding the ones that are alike, we still have 50% that are het for piebald, and then the other 50% are visual piebalds. Last pairing, we have het for piebald to a het for piebald. This one is pretty interesting. So in the first quadrant, we have two n's, uppercase n's, meaning these are all normals. So these are normals. And we have two quadrants that are het for pied, which means out of this pairing, half of them will be het for pied. And the last quadrant has two p's, meaning these are visual pieds. All three of these would look normal. You would have no idea which ones are actually normal and which ones carry the pied genes. Only 25% of the population of the offsprings will actually look like pieds, which means out of 4 babies, one of them would look like pied, the other 3 would look normal. Let's compare the results of our piebald gene with the results of the albino gene. So earlier we just saw a piebald to piebald pairing that produced 100% babies that are piebalds. Last week, we saw albino to albino pairing, and it produced 100% of the offsprings as albinos. We also saw that piebald to a het piebald will produce half of the babies will be piebald and half of them will be heifer piebald. In both these scenarios, they're the same. And last week, when we paired a albino to a het piebald, we got the same results. 50% will be heifer albino and 50% will be albino. So again, those percentages are the same. Last pairing, we have heifer piebald to heifer piebald, and we have the results are 25% will be piebald and 75% will be normal. With the albino pairing, same thing occurred. 25% will be albino and the remaining 75% will look normal. Now let's see what happens when we combine the albino gene and the piebald gene. Our hope is to produce albino piebald babies, but of course we can't just throw any two adult snakes together. We need adult snakes that both carry at least one albino gene and one piebald gene. We know that het albino is an NA, and we know that a het piebald is an NP. So at a minimum, we need adult snakes that are NA and NP. Let's see what happens if we breed two of these together. In order to do that, we need to use a larger Punnett Square. This one has 4 cells across and 4 cells down, totaling 16 cells. And we need to fill this in. So let's see what we're supposed to put across the top and across down the left. We know that genes come in pairs. So we need to take this set and put them across the top. What we have to do is we take the first letter of each pair of genes. So in this case we have an N and an N. We put that here. Next, we take the first letter of this set and the last letter of this set. So that's NP. Then we take the second letter of the first pair and the first letter of the second pair. That's AN, but I like to write it as NA. The order doesn't matter here. And lastly, we take the second letter of the first pair and the second letter of the second pair. We end up with AP. Now we do the same thing for this, and we're going to write that on the left. It's pretty much going to be the same because it is exactly the same. So we have N, P, N, A, and A, P. So now, just like the smaller Punnett Square, we basically have to bring these genes down and these genes across. Alright, so I've gone ahead and filled in the grid, but just so you guys know how to do it, I'm going to walk through filling out the first row. All we need to do is combine what's on the left with what's on the top. So here we have NN and NN. That's why inside the cell you see NN and NN. Then we have NN and NP, and inside the cell we have NN, NP. Now we have NN and NA, and as you can see, inside the cell is NN and NA. And then the last cell, to fill out the last cell, we have NN and AP. And as you can see, I wrote it a little bit different. I could have wrote NNAP, but to keep things consistent, I decided to group it a little bit differently. So I wrote NANP, and the reason I did that is because we know that NA and NP stands for het albino, het pied, which is our pairing. Het albino, het pied, het albino, and het pied. Any cell that contains a visual contains two A's or two P's, you automatically have a visual recessive animal. So for example, over here you have two P's, that's a visual piebald. Over here you have two A's, that's a visual albino. This cell here contains Na and Na and PP. It's a visual piebald. While it carries one copy of the albino gene, it's referred to as a piebald het albino. This other cell is a visual albino, and it carries one copy of the piebald gene. It's referred to as albino het piebald. There's other cells that carry an Na and an NP. So for example, right here you have Na and NP. It means it looks completely like a normal, but carry one copy of the albino gene and one copy of the piebald gene. It's referred to as het albino, het piebald, or sometimes people shorten that and call it double het albino piebald. This one we looked at earlier, it's a very easy one. It's got all ends, means it's completely normal. Alright, so since we are looking for a baby that is visually albino and visually piebald, we need to look for a cell that contains two A's and two P's. As expected, it would be this cell right here, the last one, because up here we have two recessive, over here we have two recessive, so it just makes sense that the intersecting cell would have all recessive. Now that we know an albino piebald baby can be achieved, let's find out the odds of actually hitting our goal. There are 16 cells in the grid that we saw, and only one cell has what we want. So the odds are 1 in 16. That means if we get 16 eggs, we have a good chance one of them will have an albino piebald baby in it. But seeing most young females give only 4 to 8 eggs in their first few years, 1 in 16 is not very good odds, because we may not get any albino piebalds at all during certain years. By the way, for those of you who work in percentages, 1 in 16 equates to 6.25%. If you want the best odds, you need 2 adult ball pythons that are both visually albino and visually piebald. However, that would be a very expensive purchase in most cases, and likely that won't be very interesting in the Punnett Square exercise. So why don't we look for something more interesting and a little bit easier on your wallet? One less expensive option would be to use a albino het pied male, and we can breed him to a double het female that we saw in the earlier example. The male will be represented as AA for the albino, NP for the het pied, and we're going to breed him to the female that we had earlier, which is NANP. Now we have to put that into a larger Punnett square. So what's going to go across the top is we have A to N, so I'm going to write that as NA. We have A to P, I'm going to write that as AP. A to N, again I'm going to write that as NA, and then A to P, I'm going to write that as AP. Over on this side we'll do exactly like we did in the earlier example, so that's N, 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 P, N, A, and lastly A, P. So I'll just work through this and I'll show you the results. As we review the results, we can see there are now 2 out of 16. We have 2 in 16 chance of getting an albino pied baby. That may not seem like much of an improvement from the 1 in 16, but we literally just improve our odds by 100%. If you remember from math class, 2 out of 16 can be written as 1 out of 8. If a snake can produce 8 eggs, we have a good chance of one of them being an albino baby. Whereas in the last example, it was 1 out of 16, and if the snake only produced 8 eggs, there's a chance that none of them will be the albino pied baby. So now we have increased our chances to the point that we can expect 1 per season if the female lays 8 eggs. So that's how you use the 16-cell Punnett Square. Keep in mind, we're just playing with odds. So it's possible you still don't get any albino pied babies in one season, and then in the next season you get a bunch more. But at least this gives you a sense of the adult snakes you're about to breed is even worth the effort. And depending on your time and money and how much you value your resources, your answer may not be the same as mine. For those of you who may not be comfortable with the 16-cell Punnett Square, you can still determine the odds by using the four-quadrant Punnett Square. Here's how. So in our last pairing, we had an albino to a het pied and a het albino to a het pied. All we have to do is group the like recessive genes together. So we have albino to het albino. We group that here, albino to het albino. Then we have het pied to het pied, and we have het pied to het pied. Now you can use the 4-quadrant Punnett Squares on each of these. So if we start like this, we would basically need to fill these in appropriately. Now, we don't actually have to work through these because it turns out we already did in our previous examples. Alright, so I brought back our previous examples that match what we need to do. So we have albino up here to het albino. So we did this, albino to het albino. And the results were 50% would be albino babies and 50% would be het albino. So all we care about are the albinos. So 50% is 1/2 if we use fractions, right? The other pairing up here is het pied to het pied, and we did that as well just earlier, het pied to het pied, and we saw that out of the offsprings only 25% were pied, because that's all we care about. We're just looking at the recessive. So 25% equates to 1/4 in fractions. So we know that in this pairing, we get half the babies will be albino. In this pairing, 1/4 of the babies will be albino. And if we do our math, we just have to multiply. 1/2 times 1/4 gives us 1/8. This answer is the same as when we used the larger Punnett Square and came out to be 1/8. So we know that 1/8 of the clutch of eggs, 1 out of 8 will be the albino pie that we're looking for. And if you're not comfortable with using the larger Punnett Square, you can still use the smaller Punnett Square version and reach to the same conclusion. I think learning by doing is a great way to absorb the information. So what I have here are a few possible breedings that will still result in producing albino het pieds. Go ahead and try to work them out and see if you get better odds. If you find this video helpful, give it a like, and in the next video, we'll take a look at dominant and codominant genes. If you want to be notified, hit the subscribe button, and I'll see you next time.